Okay, econ students, we are plowing through this great material, lessons for the young economists, learning all about Austrian economics, supporting the free market, and we are on lesson 22 today, this week, and we're going to talk about government debt. And so the big picture that we want to cover is the difference between what's called a deficit and debt, the connection between debt and inflation, and how government debt makes future generations poor. I'm just going to try a quick, big picture of this. So, a deficit, the government runs an annual budget. They make projections. They say, okay, we're going to spend this much money, okay? And we're going to take in so much money. Now, if they take in this much money, but they spend this much, they're short. That's called a deficit. They're in the hole, okay? They're minus. Whenever you spending more than what you have is a deficit, all right? The opposite is if you take in more money than what you spend, you have money left over, that's called a surplus, extra, all right? So those are the two things we're going to talk about now. So a deficit, and your book uses this interesting terms, flow variable and stock variable, to talk about deficits and debt. The national debt, before we talk about those, the national debt just simply means that every year since our government has been in operation, every year they run a deficit, and it doesn't get paid, it's a deficit, they're short, then that amount of money gets added to the debt, okay? It gets added. Every year, the deficit, that which they're short on, okay? They're spending more than what they're taking in. And they borrow, okay? They borrow, so this money's all got to get paid back. So the difference, the deficit amount, the difference between what you take in and what you spend, each year gets added. And it piles higher and higher and higher. And that's called our national debt. Today in 2019, our national debt, I haven't looked recently, it changes. You can go to debtclock.com and see where it's at. I think it's about $22 trillion in debt. Now, back to these interesting terms, flow variable and stock variable. Flow variable refers to the deficit, okay? It refers to, as you're going through a period of time through the calendar year, and you're spending, your rate of spending in comparison with what you've budgeted, it's a flow, it's a variable. It might change. You might spend, you might run a deficit in this period of time, and then you might be more balanced in your spending in this period of time. A stock variable refers to the debt in a fixed amount, all right? If you could do an analogy would be, an illustration would be, water coming out of a hose to the swimming pool, all right? The flow variable, like the deficit is the flow variable, that's the water, the rate at which water is coming out of the hose. The stock variable is the amount of water that's in the pool, all right? So deficit spending is a flow variable. There's a rate that it happens at. And debt is a stock variable, meaning there's a certain amount, all right? And don't get hung up on stock and variable. You just need to be aware of the terminology as we're reading. Now, face value. When you talk about debt, the government sells bonds to make up the difference. They might sell bonds to individuals. They might sell bonds to that agency called the Federal Reserve. And the bonds have a face value. And the face value is what they end up paying you back, okay? Let's see here. For what's called zero coupon bonds, usually that happens in less time period of a year, where they borrow money and they pay it back. So the face value actually just includes the interest in it, all right? There's an interest amount. The face value of the bond is includes the interest in it. All right. If they're selling you bonds over a period of time, then you're going to probably get a different coupon book with the interest payments on it. All right. So face value though refers to the amount of money that the government actually pays back the person, the borrower, or the lender. I'm sorry, the lender. All right. National debt. Okay, we've already talked about national debt. So those are the big pictures about government debt. Government debt is not tightly connected to inflation. Remember, when the government when the government issues bonds to the Federal Reserve prints money and pumps new money into the economy. That creates inflation. All right. A government debt is inflationary, but they're not strictly connected. However, if the government is running a deficit and they need to borrow money, they might not go to the Fed first. They may first go to individuals and issue bonds. In other words, borrow money from individuals and pay back through bonds. When that happens, it's not inflationary because the lenders are using the money that they presently have and loaning that to the government. Okay, so no new money has been created. In fact, lender money has now become available, is not available to them because they've loaned it over here. So there's nothing inflationary from that standpoint. Just so you know the difference between the two. And then government debt in future generations. Yes, government debt is bad because it's going to tax future generations for today's purchases. But there are other subtle ways in which it impoverishes future generations. For example, there's a term called crowding, and that's when the government spends money and it crowds out the private sector. It might create public works jobs that could have been created in the private sector, but those have now been crowded out because government is going to do this. It may borrow money. Well, I won't get to that part yet. Another thing it will do is it will, by spending today and paying later on, actually a very subtle thing that happens is because of this crowding out of the private sector, there's less capital available, all right, in the future for future generations than there was at the time. So that's another subtle way. We'll talk more about that, but that's just a big picture. Understand crowding out. That's a term your book uses, and it's when the government spends money and the result of their spending eliminates something that the private sector could have done. That is the big picture of government debt. And we'll talk a lot about that. We got a project that we're going to work on this week with that, but that's the big picture of government debt. All right? So